we've got how many homeless people across America right now, people experiencing homelessness? How many would you say, using the most common sense definition? I know we get into a lot of different definitions, but the most common sense definition, how many people are experiencing homelessness?
So I think the number's closer to 5 million, and
Yeah.
it may even be higher than that, in my opinion. And this is Donald Whitehead's opinion. It's really hard to quantify homelessness. People are hard to find. People live doubled up. And I think doubled up, if you don't have a fixed address and somebody can walk in that apartment and say you have to leave, you should be considered homeless.
Right.
But most of the federal departments don't consider doubled up homeless. And so the numbers vary, as you say. The Department of Education says alone there's 3.5 million children that are homeless. So the numbers that we see typically are 3.5 million. Sometimes we see 500 on a given night, but those are all undercounts. And I do believe that's a fundamental reason we haven't addressed this issue in a way that really dramatically reduces the number, because we're using numbers that don't reach the scale of the problem. So, we have a Congress that's looking at creating solutions for 500,000 people when there's more like 5 million people. And, if we don't ever raise those resources to the scale, I think we're almost there in Build Back Better, the original version that had like $75 million for housing. I'm sorry, $25 billion for housing, 70 million for public housing alone. We were getting close, and that wasn't even enough. But we keep coming up with these myopic solutions. And let me say one other thing about structural racism. I want to say this, that I'm not saying that everybody in America is a racist. I'm not saying that white people in America don't experience the same issues. And the majority of the people that are homeless are white. But I'm saying that people who are white never have to experience these issues of discrimination based on the color of their skin. And yourself, you've been through struggles. We saw people on a panel today who went through struggles. We know all kinds of people go through struggles. The difference is it's not because of the color of their skin. And the solutions, what really gets to me, I've been reading a book by Heather McGhee. It's called The Sum of Us. So there's such a resistance to solutions that could actually help solve this problem. And those solutions would benefit everybody. They wouldn't just benefit people of color, they benefit everybody. It's universalism. So think of Medicaid expansion, for instance. More people that are white need Medicaid expansion than people of color, but we've resisted doing that. Why? In those communities where there are hospitals closing every day, Texas, for instance, won't expand Medicare, and they have more hospitals closing than anywhere in the country. It just doesn't make sense. If we solve homelessness for everybody, it benefits everybody in the country. We don't have to utilize the resources that we're using, but for some reason, we resist that, and it just pains me to say that.
Well, however they got there, however these people that are living on the streets, whether they're hopping from shelter to shelter, whether it's chronic, whether they're 6 months or they're 6 years, whether they got there through discrimination, mental illness, drug addiction, whatever it is, the solution, as you say, is going to have to be universal, and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. The biggest challenge that I scratch my head about when I'm thinking about this is you've got a big percentage that have become addicts. You've got a big percentage that are mentally ill.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a big percentage that are just financially disadvantaged and just simply don't have the earning power, the wherewithal, the traction to get to the point where they can get a place to live, pay the deposits for utilities, and sustain it. I mean, I'm sure there are more, and there's a lot of overlap within those, but those are three different groups that are going to need nuances to their solutions. But all of them have some things in common, You can describe it a lot of different ways, but one way we've talked about it before is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The first thing you've got to do is actually meet their survival needs, where they know, I'm not going to freeze to death, I'm not going to starve to death, I'm not going to be murdered, I'm not going to die from the elements or whatever. I've at least got that covered. And that's why you say that it begins with getting them in a safe home.
Yes.
And we know that we have enough empty places in the United States to put everybody, but we don't do it. I suppose that people have the right to rent their places to whoever they want to. Does it make sense in New York City to go in and buy a hotel, rent up a whole hotel, which has been done?
Mm-hmm.
Did that work? They did it for a while and then they didn't.
It worked very well. It not only addressed many of the issues that people have, privacy for one, the ability to engage multiple people at a time, the fact that those congregate shelters are not safe when it comes to the transmission of disease. So it worked very well. It worked because it was a robust response, and it was a response like we would do in any other emergency situation. And so people really thrived. We got to move people into some of those permanent housing units that we talked about. Unfortunately, though, those resources were short term. Now, some communities like Denver, Colorado, they actually bought those hotels. Other communities did that, but many communities didn't have that foresight, and so they basically leased the hotels, and then they ran out of money. It was a response for the pandemic, and those dollars aren't available anymore, and so people are starting to go back to the streets. But it was a great instrument for people to change.
Does it make better sense to go in and buy a hotel that's existing? And I'm not talking about, Four Seasons. I'm talking about someplace where you can get a lot of units that fit the bill. Does it make sense to go in and buy an existing facility with a couple of hundred units in it, or to build them from scratch? What makes the most sense financially?
It depends on the market and the cost. I think the hotel purchase would probably be more financially feasible in most communities. And I also think one of the issues is that if you build that multifamily unit, it's going to take you 7 or 8 years.
That's what I'm saying.
Exactly.
It's a long time.
It's a long time proposition. However, if you purchase an already existing building and you make whatever kind of repairs are necessary, then you've got instant resources. And so I think that it is a much better proposition to go ahead and buy that hotel. And as I said, the communities that had the resources and the forethought, they did go ahead and do that. In addition, the hotel industry suffered through the pandemic as well. And many of those are kind of on the market now. And so if you take the resources that we use for some of those other solutions that are not as practical, like criminalization, instead of putting people in jail, because there's a cost associated with that too, we should put those resources into providing housing and supportive services.
If you put somebody in jail, you're talking, what, $40,000, $50,000 a year?
Absolutely.
Per inmate?
Absolutely.
That's not cheap.
It's not cheap at all. And it's a cycle. So that person goes to jail. Now they can't get into public housing. They can't get into the other housing programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program. They can't get jobs. No one, people, there's this long list I used to get of people that would hire ex-offenders. When I was doing direct service, I'd send them there and nobody ever got hired. So, it's hard to get a job. It's hard to get, you lose the opportunity to vote. I mean, you lose your connection to society.
Yeah.
So the cost is even higher than that, initial cost of jailing them.
And a lot of these people that are in jail, and certainly would be in jail if that model is allowed to go forward, let's just be honest, they're in jail because they're homeless. They're loitering or because they've got nothing else to do. They default to drugs. their crime is having nothing going for them at that point.
Absolutely. It's a cascading cycle. So they get a loitering ticket. They get a fine. They don't pay the fine. Then it becomes failure to pay fine. There may be an interaction when they're arrested and they get a resisting charge. And so it continues to mount. Just having an arrest is a big enough barrier. But when it becomes a felony, a lot of doors get closed to you. It's unbelievable in some communities. So we don't have public bathrooms in most communities, right? So if it's a physiological event that has to happen to every person in the world. So in states like Florida, if you're caught urinating in public, and nobody's condoning urinating in public, but you have to urinate.
You got to go. You got to go.
If you get caught, you're a sex offender. And so not only are you arrested, you've become a sex offender. And if you think it's hard to get a job with a criminal record, if you're a sex offender, you can't even go to some shelters. And so, it's really a ridiculous, of course, we don't want anybody who's exposing themselves in public, but that's not who's getting charged with those kinds of crimes. It's somebody who's in the woods or behind a building and somebody just comes upon them and their life is totally ruined at that point. It's very different from other kinds of
It's hard to unring that
offenses.
bell.
No, it absolutely is.